The rain hammered the cobblestones of Petiano like bullets on the morning of May the 31st, 1972. Three carabinieri stepped out of their Alfa Romeo, steam rising from the engine hood as they approached what appeared to be an abandoned Fiat on the roadside. Officer Antonio Ferraro bent down to examine the vehicle more closely. The explosion that followed would echo through 4 decades of European history, tearing not just flesh from bone, but ripping away the comfortable illusions of post-war democracy. What those officers discovered in their final moments was not merely a bomb, but the first thread in a web of deception that stretched from the mountains of northern Italy to the corridors of NATO headquarters, from the cafes of Munich to the snow-covered forests of Scandinavia. The blast killed all 3 men instantly. For 18 years, investigators blamed the Red Brigades, those shadowy leftist terrorists who haunted the nightmares of middle-class Italians. The case seemed closed, filed away in the dusty archives of failed investigations. But in January 1990, an Italian judge named Felice Casson requested access to military intelligence files. What he found would shatter the carefully constructed narrative of Cold War Europe and expose a parallel universe of secret armies, false flag operations, and state-sponsored terror that had operated beneath the surface of Western democracy for over 4 decades. Judge Casson discovered that the Petiano bombing had been carried out not by communist insurgents, but by a right-wing extremist named Vincenzo Vinciguerra, who had connections to a clandestine organization that few Italians had ever heard of. Operation Gladio. The name itself evoked ancient Rome, referring to the double-edged sword used by gladiators in the arena. How fitting, Casson would later reflect, that this modern gladius would prove equally capable of cutting both ways, against foreign enemies and domestic ones. On a foggy November evening in 1947, in a manor house somewhere in the English countryside, a small group of men gathered around a mahogany table laden with classified documents. Among them sat representatives from the nascent CIA, British intelligence operatives still bearing the psychological scars of World War II, and military planners who had watched the Red Army sweep across Eastern Europe like a crimson tide. The topic of discussion was not conventional warfare, but something far more sinister: how to prepare for defeat. The concept was deceptively simple. If Soviet tanks rolled across the plains of Northern Europe, if communist parties seized power through electoral victory or revolutionary force, these men would ensure that resistance continued. They called them stay-behind networks. Secret armies that would remain hidden behind enemy lines, emerging from the shadows to conduct sabotage, assassination, and psychological warfare. William Colby, the CIA officer tasked with establishing these networks in Scandinavia, would later write that the operatives had to be coordinated with NATO's plans, their radios had to be hooked to a future exile location, and the specialized equipment had to be secured from the CIA and secretly cached in snowy hideouts for later use. But what began as a defensive strategy against Soviet invasion would evolve into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. By the 1950s, these networks had developed a secondary mission that would define their true legacy: preventing communist parties from gaining power through democratic means. The architects of this strategy understood that the greatest threat to Western capitalism might not come from Soviet tanks, but from ballot boxes. In Italy, the stay-behind network took the name Gladio sometime in the late 1950s. The organization recruited heavily from the political right, drawing members from former fascist militias, veterans of Mussolini's Republic of Salo, and mercenaries who had fought alongside Franco in the Spanish Civil War. As Licio Gelli, the notorious Masonic leader and Gladio coordinator, would later explain, they chose individuals who were proven anti-communists. I know it was a well-constructed organization. Had communist strength grown in Italy, America would have assisted us. We would have unleashed another war, and we would have been generously supplied with arms from the air. The financial arrangements were generous enough to ensure loyalty. Gladio operatives received salaries equivalent to those of successful businessmen, and their families were guaranteed support should they die in service. The funding came directly from Washington, channeled through a complex network of front companies and charitable organizations. By the 1960s, Gladio had established 139 arms caches across Italy, hidden in forests, meadows, churches, and even cemeteries. The arsenal included everything from portable firearms to 60mm mortars, explosives, radio transmitters, and specialized assassination equipment. The strategy that would define Gladio's domestic operations became known as the strategy of tension, a psychological warfare campaign designed to create an atmosphere of fear and instability that would justify authoritarian measures and discredit left-wing political movements. The theory was elegantly simple. Stage terrorist attacks that could be blamed on communist groups, then use the resulting public outrage to justify repressive legislation and emergency powers. The Italian population, terrified by seemingly random violence, would willingly trade democratic freedoms for the promise of security. On December 12, 1969, this strategy reached its bloody crescendo in Milan's Piazza Fontana. At 4:37 in the afternoon, a bomb exploded in the crowded lobby of the Banca Nazionale dell'Agricoltura, killing 17 people and wounding 88 others. The explosion occurred during peak banking hours, ensuring maximum casualties among ordinary Italian citizens. Farmers depositing their earnings, small businessmen conducting transactions, elderly pensioners collecting their benefits. Within hours, police had arrested dozens of suspected leftist terrorists, including the anarchist Giuseppe Pinelli. 3 days later, Pinelli mysteriously fell to his death from a fourth-floor window of Milan's police headquarters. Officials claimed suicide, but witnesses reported that he had been thrown from the window during interrogation. The incident sparked riots across northern Italy, as the public began to suspect that something far more sinister was occurring beneath the surface of their democracy. Years later, investigators would discover that the Piazza Fontana bombing had been carried out by right-wing extremists with connections to Gladio networks, operating under the direction of NATO intelligence services. The attack was designed to be blamed on communist groups, creating public support for authoritarian measures that would prevent the Italian Communist Party from gaining electoral victory. As one former intelligence operative would later testify, "We understood domestic subversion to mean a change of government that did not respect the will of the ruling authority." The psychological impact of the Piazza Fontana bombing extended far beyond its immediate victims. Middle-class Italians, who had previously viewed political violence as an abstract threat, suddenly found themselves living in a country where death could arrive without warning in the most mundane locations. Banks, train stations, and public squares became potential battlegrounds. Parents began keeping their children closer to home. Business leaders demanded increased police powers. The democratic process itself became suspect. How could a system that allowed communist parties to participate in elections protect citizens from such brutality? What the Italian public did not know was that their trauma was being carefully orchestrated by the very institutions supposedly protecting them. Intelligence services monitored public opinion through sophisticated polling operations, adjusting their strategy based on how effectively each attack shifted political sentiment. When bombings failed to generate sufficient anti-communist feeling, they were followed by secondary operations designed to maintain pressure on the political system. The goal was not simply to prevent communist electoral victory, but to fundamentally alter the political consciousness of the Italian people. The network spread across Western Europe like an underground mycelium, adapting to local conditions while maintaining coordination through NATO command structures. In Denmark, the stay-behind army was codenamed Absalon, after a medieval archbishop who had crusaded against pagan Slavs. The symbolism was intentional. These modern crusaders saw themselves as defenders of Christian civilization against godless communism. In Germany, the network recruited heavily from former Wehrmacht officers and SS veterans who possessed both military expertise and burning hatred for their former Soviet allies. By the 1970s, Gladio had evolved into something that resembled a parallel state within the Italian state. The organization maintained its own intelligence networks, conducted independent foreign operations, and possessed the capability to influence domestic politics through both covert propaganda and direct violence. Members of parliament, journalists, and business leaders found themselves under constant surveillance. Phone calls were monitored, mail was opened, and personal relationships were mapped by analysts seeking leverage points for future operations. The true genius of the Gladio system lay not in its violence, but in its invisibility. Unlike traditional military occupations or authoritarian coups, the stay-behind networks operated through what intelligence professionals call plausible deniability. Each terrorist attack could be attributed to extremist groups acting independently. Each political assassination could be explained as the work of criminals or foreign agents. The democratic process continued to function, elections were held on schedule, and Parliament debated legislation with apparent freedom. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy, a shadow government was systematically manipulating public opinion and eliminating political opposition. As Judge Casson would later discover in those dusty military archives, the Gladio networks had compiled detailed psychological profiles of the Italian population, identifying which types of violence would prove most effective at shifting political opinion. Bombings in public spaces created generalized fear that could be directed against any target. Assassinations of moderate political leaders eliminated voices calling for compromise or coalition government. False flag operations blamed on communist groups created a permanent association between leftist politics and terrorism in the public mind. The rain continued to fall on that October evening in 1990 when Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti finally stood before the Italian Senate to confirm what Judge Casson had discovered in those classified files. Operation Gladio was real. The secret armies existed. The stay-behind networks had been active for over 4 decades, funded by American intelligence and coordinated through NATO command structures. As Andreotti's words echoed through the chamber, parliamentarians struggled to comprehend the implications of what they were hearing. Their democracy had been infiltrated from its very foundation. Their sovereignty had been compromised by allies claiming to defend it. The revelation would trigger investigations across Western Europe as other governments were forced to acknowledge their own stay-behind networks. But for the families of those 3 carabinieri killed at Petiano, for the survivors of Piazza Fontana, for the countless victims of 4 decades of state-sponsored terrorism, the truth had come too late. The Gladius had already done its work, carving away pieces of European democracy with surgical precision, leaving scars that would never fully heal. The telephone rang at 3:17 in the morning in a modest apartment overlooking the Tiber, waking Colonel Roberto Ricci from dreams of his childhood in Tuscany. The voice on the other end spoke a single code phrase: "The harvest moon is rising." Within 40 minutes, Ricci was driving through the empty streets of Rome, heading toward a safe house in the Parioli district where his handler was waiting with instructions that would change the course of Italian politics forever. This was March 1978, and Aldo Moro, the moderate Christian democratic leader who represented everything the Gladio networks most feared, had just 55 days left to live. The kidnapping of Aldo Moro on March 16, 1978, began like a scene from a perfectly choreographed ballet of violence. At 9:05, as Moro's blue Fiat 130 sedan approached the intersection of Via Fani and Via Stresa in central Rome, a white Fiat 128 suddenly swerved across its path, forcing the official vehicle to brake hard. Within seconds, gunmen emerged from 4 different positions, their weapons already trained on the occupants of both cars. The precision was surgical, the timing flawless. 5 members of Moro's security detail died in the first 30 seconds of gunfire, their bodies riddled with bullets from Scorpion submachine guns, weapons that investigators would later trace to a Gladio arms cache near Nettuno. The Red Brigades claimed responsibility for the operation within hours, but intelligence analysts working for Judge Carlo Palermo would later discover anomalies that suggested a far more complex orchestration. The terrorists demonstrated knowledge of Moro's security protocols that should have been impossible for an outside organization to obtain. They knew which routes his convoy would take, which agents would be on duty, and even which radio frequencies the protection team would monitor. Most disturbing of all, they possessed detailed floor plans of the various safe houses where Moro would be held during his 55 days of captivity. What the public did not know was that Aldo Moro had become a marked man not because of his prominence in Christian democratic politics, but because of his secret negotiations with Enrico Berlinguer, the leader of the Italian Communist Party. For months, the two men had been working toward what they called the Historic Compromise, a coalition government that would bring communists into power through democratic means for the first time since the Second World War. From the perspective of NATO planners and CIA strategists, this represented the ultimate nightmare scenario, the voluntary surrender of a Western democracy to Marxist influence. General Vito Miceli, the former head of Italian military intelligence, would later testify that American officials had made their position clear during a classified briefing in 1977. Any government, including communists, would be considered unacceptable and would face appropriate countermeasures. The euphemistic language masked a brutal reality. Aldo Moro was being sentenced to death not by revolutionary extremists, but by the same intelligence network supposedly protecting Italian democracy. The machinery of psychological manipulation that surrounded Moro's kidnapping began operating immediately after news of his capture reached the public. Editorial writers across Italy began publishing remarkably similar analyses, arguing that any negotiation with terrorists would represent an unacceptable surrender to extremism. Television commentators emphasized the communist connections of the Red Brigades, carefully avoiding any mention of the organization's links to Western intelligence services. Public opinion polls, conducted by research firms with undisclosed CIA funding, showed overwhelming support for a hard-line approach that would refuse any dialogue with the kidnappers. Meanwhile, in the basement of a Rome safe house, Aldo Moro sat chained to a cot, writing letters that would never reach their intended recipients. His captors had allowed him paper and pencil, ostensibly to compose political testament messages that would be released after his execution. But intelligence officers monitoring the operation ensured that only selected portions of these writings ever reached the public. The full texts, discovered decades later in former KGB archives, revealed that Moro had identified his kidnappers as trained professionals with detailed knowledge of NATO security procedures. Hardly the profile of amateur communist revolutionaries. In those handwritten pages, Moro pleaded with his Christian democratic colleagues to understand that his kidnapping was not the work of spontaneous political extremism, but part of a larger strategy designed to prevent Italian democracy from evolving in directions unacceptable to foreign powers. "They know things about our party that only insiders could know," he wrote in one letter that was suppressed for 20 years. "This is not terrorism as we understand it, but something far more sophisticated and dangerous to our sovereignty." The international dimension of Operation Gladio became most visible through its recruitment and training programs, which operated like a cross between elite military academies and terrorist boot camps. Young men with appropriate political credentials were identified through a network of Catholic organizations, veteran associations, and neo-fascist political groups. The ideal candidate possessed military experience, demonstrated anti-communist commitment, physical fitness, and most importantly, the psychological profile necessary for conducting operations against civilian targets. Training took place at facilities scattered across Western Europe and North America, each specializing in different aspects of unconventional warfare. The primary Italian facility was located near the seaside town of Alghero in Sardinia, where recruits underwent months of intensive instruction in explosives, assassination techniques, psychological operations, and radio communications. The curriculum included practical exercises in staging false flag attacks, manipulating media coverage, and coordinating with law enforcement agencies to ensure that blame would be properly assigned to intended targets. But the most sophisticated training occurred at a classified facility known as Base Harp, located in the mountains of North Carolina. This installation, operated jointly by the CIA and Green Berets, provided advanced instruction in what euphemistically became known as democracy preservation techniques. European intelligence operatives attended semester-long courses covering everything from election manipulation to the systematic elimination of political opposition. The facility maintained detailed psychological profiles of European political leaders, identifying which figures represented long-term threats to NATO's strategic objectives. Colonel Amos Spiazzi, who commanded the Italian Army's 4th Alpine Brigade and served as a senior Gladio coordinator, would later describe the chilling efficiency of these programs. We learned not just how to kill people, but how to kill the right people at the right time to achieve maximum political effect. Every operation was planned like a chess game, with each move calculated to produce specific reactions from the public and political establishment. The Belgian Stay-Behind network, code-named SDA-8, demonstrated the international scope of Gladio operations through its intimate connections with right-wing paramilitary groups across Europe. Led by former SS Obergruppenführer Léon de Grelle and financed through a complex web of shell companies, SDA-8 established arms caches in forests throughout the Ardennes region, the same territory where Nazi forces had launched their final offensive against Allied armies in 1944. The symbolism was intentional, representing the continuity between fascist resistance to Allied occupation and contemporary resistance to communist influence. Belgian investigators discovered that SDA-8 had maintained detailed surveillance files on over 40,000 Belgian citizens, including teachers, union leaders, social workers, and journalists whose political views were deemed potentially subversive. The organization operated through a cell structure that compartmentalized information, ensuring that individual operatives could not compromise the entire network if captured or turned. Communication occurred through coded messages broadcast on shortwave radio frequencies, using encryption systems developed by former Wehrmacht signal officers who had been recruited by American intelligence after the war. The arms caches discovered in Belgian forests during the 1980s contained enough military hardware to equip a small army. 360 automatic weapons, 80,000 rounds of ammunition, 200 kilograms of plastique explosives, and specialized assassination equipment, including poisoned bullets and explosive devices designed to appear like ordinary household objects. Perhaps most disturbing were the detailed targeting lists found alongside the weapons, identifying specific individuals who were to be eliminated in the event of communist electoral victory. General Henri Serraval, who commanded Italian Gladio operations from 1971 to 1974, provided crucial insights into the international coordination of stay-behind networks during testimony before the Italian Senate's Commission on Terrorism. He revealed that representatives from all European networks met annually in different NATO capitals, with CIA observers present at every session. These gatherings, known within intelligence circles as the coordination meetings, established operational priorities, shared intelligence on potential targets, and distributed funding for upcoming operations. The meetings followed a rigid protocol that emphasized both security and efficiency. Each national representative arrived using diplomatic cover, carrying encrypted communications equipment that allowed real-time consultation with home governments. Discussions covered everything from the political reliability of specific European leaders to the optimal timing for false flag operations designed to influence electoral outcomes. Minutes were recorded in code, with copies stored in secure facilities at NATO headquarters and CIA stations throughout Europe. Most significantly, these coordination meetings established the doctrine that would define Gladio operations throughout the 1970s and 80s, the principle of anticipatory intervention. Rather than waiting for communist parties to gain power through democratic means, stay-behind networks would actively work to prevent such outcomes through strategic violence, media manipulation, and the systematic intimidation of moderate political leaders who might be tempted to form coalition governments with the left. The German stay-behind network, designated Organisation Gehlen after its founder Reinhard Gehlen, former head of Wehrmacht intelligence on the Eastern Front, represented the most militarized branch of the broader Gladio system. Gehlen had surrendered to American forces in May 1945, bringing with him detailed intelligence files on Soviet military capabilities and the names of thousands of anti-communist agents throughout Eastern Europe. Within months of his capture, he was working directly for American intelligence services, using his knowledge of Soviet operations to establish infiltration networks behind the Iron Curtain. By the 1950s, Organization Galen had evolved into a parallel intelligence service within West Germany, maintaining independent communication networks, funding mechanisms, and operational capabilities that sometimes conflicted with official government policy. The organization recruited heavily from former SS officers, Wehrmacht veterans, and refugees from Eastern Europe who possessed both the motivation and expertise necessary for conducting operations against communist targets. Training facilities in the Bavarian Alps provided instruction in sabotage, assassination, and psychological warfare techniques adapted from Nazi-era Sonderkommando operations. The psychological profile of typical Gladio recruits revealed disturbing patterns that intelligence psychologists had identified through extensive testing programs. The ideal operative demonstrated above-average intelligence combined with rigid ideological commitment, physical courage paired with emotional detachment, and most critically, the ability to compartmentalize moral considerations that might interfere with operational effectiveness. These were not psychopaths or sadists, but rather individuals who had been systematically conditioned to view political violence as a necessary tool for preserving civilization against existential threats. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a former Wehrmacht psychiatrist who developed personality assessment protocols for Gladio recruitment, described the selection process in clinical terms that masked its sinister implications. We sought individuals capable of maintaining functional relationships with family and colleagues while simultaneously conducting operations that most people would find morally reprehensible. The successful candidate demonstrates what we termed compartmentalized patriotism, the ability to commit acts of violence against fellow citizens while genuinely believing such actions serve the greater good of democratic society. The financial infrastructure supporting Gladio operations across Europe required enormous resources channeled through increasingly sophisticated money laundering networks. The Vatican Bank served as a crucial intermediary, using its diplomatic immunity and religious cover to transfer millions of dollars in CIA funding to operational accounts throughout Europe. Cardinal Paul Marcinkus, who served as president of the Vatican's Institute for the Works of Religion, maintained personal relationships with senior intelligence officers and provided banking services that allowed American funds to flow to stay-behind networks without detection by European governments. The money trail connected Gladio operations to some of the most notorious financial scandals of the late 20th century, including the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano and the mysterious death of its president, Roberto Calvi, whose body was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London in June 1982. Investigators discovered that Calvi had been laundering Gladio funds through a complex network of shell companies registered in tax havens from Luxembourg to the Cayman Islands, providing financing for false flag operations while simultaneously enriching corrupt officials throughout the Vatican hierarchy. As night fell over Rome on May 9, 1978, a red Renault 4 pulled up beside a garbage dump on Via Caetani, not far from the headquarters of both the Christian Democratic Party and the Italian Communist Party. The symbolism was carefully calculated. Aldo Moro's body, discovered in the trunk of that car, represented the death of democratic compromise and the triumph of strategies designed to maintain permanent political polarization. The historic compromise died with him, ensuring that Italy would remain locked in the rigid ideological divisions that served NATO strategic interests. The investigation into Moro's murder would continue for decades, producing thousands of pages of testimony and evidence that gradually revealed the true scope of stay-behind operations. But for the intelligence officers who had orchestrated his death, the mission was already complete. Italian democracy had been preserved, not from foreign invasion, but from the dangerous possibility that voters might choose a path different from the one predetermined by their supposed protectors. In the shadows of European democracy, the gladiators continued their deadly dance, serving masters who remained forever hidden behind the facade of freedom they claimed to defend. The silence of the Monte dei Paschi bank vault in Siena was broken only by the soft clicking of combination locks as Chief Inspector Marco Benedetti descended into the basement archives on the morning of August 2, 1980. What he discovered among the dust-covered safety deposit boxes would transform his understanding of Italian democracy forever. Inside box number 743 lay documents that revealed how the Banco Ambrosiano, the Vatican Bank, and American intelligence services had been financing a continental network of terror operations designed to reshape European politics through systematic violence. The papers bore the letterhead of Propaganda Due, the secret Masonic lodge that served as the coordination center for what its members called the preservation of Western Christian civilization. The Bologna Massacre of August 2nd, 1980, began at 10:25 on a Saturday morning when the central railway station was packed with families heading to seaside resorts for their summer holidays. The explosion occurred in the second-class waiting room where travelers with modest incomes gathered with their children and elderly relatives, clutching paper bags containing sandwiches and thermos bottles filled with coffee. The bomb, hidden inside an unattended suitcase, contained over 20 kilograms of TNT mixed with fragments of metal designed to maximize human casualties. Within seconds, the waiting room was transformed into a charnel house of dismembered bodies and screaming survivors. 85 people died in the blast, while over 200 others suffered injuries that would mark them for life. The official investigation into the Bologna bombing followed patterns that had become tragically familiar to Italian magistrates. Within hours, police arrested several members of leftist terrorist organizations, parading them before television cameras as the perpetrators of this unspeakable crime. Newspapers published editorials condemning the communist underground, while television commentators analyzed the attack as evidence of Marxist determination to destroy Italian democracy through indiscriminate violence. Public opinion polls showed a dramatic shift towards support for authoritarian measures, exactly as the architects of the strategy of tension had intended. But Judge Felice Casson, working with a small team of investigators who had begun to uncover the truth about Operation Gladio, discovered evidence that pointed in an entirely different direction. The explosive materials used in the Bologna bombing matched samples found in Gladio arms caches near Naples and Turin. The timing device bore serial numbers that traced back to equipment provided by the CIA to stay behind networks throughout Europe. Most damning of all, telephone intercepts revealed conversations between known Gladio operatives discussing the Big Show, scheduled for early August 1980. Licio Gelli, the venerable master of propaganda, Due and one of the most powerful men in Italy, maintained his luxurious villa in Arezzo with the confidence of someone who possessed enough secrets to topple governments. The estate sprawled across 40 hectares of Tuscan countryside, protected by electronic surveillance systems and patrolled by security guards recruited from former members of elite military units. In the basement of the main house, Gelli maintained what he called his insurance collection. Thousands of photographs, documents, and audio recordings that documented the intimate connections between European intelligence services, the Vatican hierarchy, right-wing terrorist groups, and the highest levels of NATO command structure. The Propaganda Due membership list, discovered during a raid on Gelli's villa in March 1981, read like a directory of Italian power. It included 962 names: cabinet ministers, Supreme Court judges, generals, admirals, police commissioners, heads of intelligence services, newspaper editors, business leaders, and Vatican officials. Among the most prominent members were Silvio Berlusconi, who would later serve as Prime Minister, General Vito Miceli, former head of military intelligence, and Cardinal Paul Marcinkus, President of the Vatican Bank. The lodge operated as a parallel government within the Italian state, coordinating policy between legitimate institutions and clandestine networks that operated beyond the reach of democratic oversight. The financial infrastructure supporting Gladio operations had evolved into a criminal enterprise of staggering proportions by the early 1980s. Roberto Calvi, president of Banco Ambrosiano and a key member of Propaganda Due, had established a network of shell companies throughout Latin America and the Caribbean that laundered hundreds of millions of dollars in CIA funding while simultaneously facilitating arms smuggling, drug trafficking, and illegal political contributions. The most notorious of these front organizations was the Institute for the Works of Religion, commonly known as the Vatican Bank, which used its diplomatic immunity to transfer funds that financed false flag operations across 3 continents. The murder of Roberto Calvi in June 1982 represented a turning point in the exposure of Gladio financial networks. His body was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London, his pockets stuffed with stones and cash in multiple currencies. The symbolism was unmistakable. Blackfriars had been the meeting place of Dominican monks, whose black robes had given the bridge its name, while Calvi's killers had arranged his corpse in a grotesque parody of Masonic ritual execution. The message was clear to anyone familiar with the occult practices of propaganda do. Those who betrayed the organization would face consequences that extended beyond mere death. Cardinal Marcinkus, the American-born prelate who served as president of the Vatican Bank from 1971 to 1989, operated with the immunity that came from his ecclesiastical status and his intimate knowledge of American intelligence operations. Born in Cicero, Illinois, to Lithuanian immigrant parents, Marcinkus had developed close relationships with senior CIA officials during his early career in Vatican diplomatic services. By the 1970s, he was facilitating the transfer of enormous sums through the Vatican's unique position as both a sovereign state and a religious institution. The Vatican Bank's role in Gladio financing became clear through documents seized during the investigation of Banco Ambrosiano's collapse. The Institute for the Works of Religion had established correspondent relationships with banks throughout Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands, creating a network that allowed American intelligence funds to flow to European terrorist organizations without detection by national governments or international banking regulators. Marcinkus personally supervised transactions totaling over $1 billion during the peak years of strategy of tension operations. The international dimension of Gladio operations reached its most sophisticated expression through the Pinay Circle, a secretive organization founded in 1958 by former French Prime Minister Antoine Pinay and CIA Director William Casey. The Circle brought together intelligence chiefs, military commanders, and political leaders from throughout the Western Alliance to coordinate psychological warfare operations against communist parties and leftist movements. Meeting annually in different European capitals, the Circle established strategic priorities that were then implemented through national stay-behind networks operating under the cover of NATO planning exercises. General Giovanni De Lorenzo, who served as Director of Italian Military Intelligence from 1956 to 1962, provided crucial testimony about the Circle's operations during closed hearings before the Italian Senate's Terrorism Commission. He revealed that the organization maintained detailed psychological profiles of European populations, identifying which types of violence would prove most effective at shifting public opinion in desired directions. The Circle's analysts had determined that attacks on innocent civilians in public spaces created generalized fear that could be directed against any political target, while assassinations of moderate leaders eliminated voices calling for compromise or coalition governments. The strategy of tension reached its most refined expression through operations conducted by specialized units that combined military training with psychological warfare expertise. These teams, known within intelligence circles as Black Operations Specialists, received instruction at facilities scattered throughout Europe and North America. The primary training center was located at a classified installation near Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where European operatives attended intensive courses in false flag operations, media manipulation, and what CIA instructors euphemistically termed democracy preservation techniques. Colonel Amos Spiazzi, who commanded Italian stay-behind operations in the Alto Adige region, later described the chilling efficiency of these programs in testimony before parliamentary investigators. The curriculum included practical exercises in staging terrorist attacks that could be blamed on political opponents, coordinating with law enforcement agencies to ensure proper assignment of responsibility, and managing media coverage to maximize psychological impact on target populations. Students learned not just how to kill people, but how to kill the right people at the right time to achieve maximum political effect. The psychological warfare dimension of Gladio operations extended far beyond simple violence into sophisticated manipulation of European popular culture. The organization maintained extensive propaganda networks that influenced everything from newspaper editorial policies to television programming, ensuring that public discourse remained within parameters acceptable to NATO strategic objectives. Journalists who attempted to investigate stay-behind activities faced harassment, threats, and in some cases, mysterious accidents that served as warnings to their colleagues. The case of Italian journalist Mauro De Mauro illustrated the dangers faced by reporters who probed too deeply into Gladio operations. De Mauro, who worked for the Palermo newspaper L'Ora, had been investigating connections between the Sicilian mafia, American intelligence services, and right-wing terrorist groups when he disappeared in September 1970. His body was never found, but intelligence documents discovered decades later revealed that he had uncovered evidence of CIA involvement in drug trafficking operations that financed stay-behind networks throughout southern Europe. His disappearance sent a clear message to other journalists about the consequences of investigating forbidden subjects. The Belgian terrorist crisis of 1982 to 1986 demonstrated how Gladio tactics had spread beyond Italy to encompass a continental strategy of destabilization. Between October 1982 and November 1985, a series of coordinated attacks killed 38 people and wounded hundreds more across Belgium. The operations were carried out by two apparently opposed groups: the Communist Combatant Cells, which claimed responsibility for attacks on NATO installations and American businesses, and an anonymous organization known as the Mad Killers, which conducted seemingly random assaults on supermarkets and restaurants. Belgian investigators eventually discovered that both groups were controlled by the same intelligence networks, operating under the direction of the Belgian State Security Service in coordination with NATO psychological warfare specialists. The leftist attacks were designed to justify increased security measures and military cooperation with the United States, while the random violence created a climate of fear that weakened public support for nuclear disarmament movements and neutralist political parties. The entire campaign was orchestrated to ensure that Belgium remained firmly within the Atlantic Alliance during a period of growing popular opposition to NATO missile deployments. The most sophisticated aspect of the Belgian operations was their use of double agents who had infiltrated both genuine leftist organizations and right-wing extremist groups. These penetration agents provided intelligence that allowed handlers to manipulate both sides of the political spectrum, creating conflicts that served the interests of neither the authentic left nor the genuine right. The technique, known within intelligence circles as controlled opposition, ensured that political dissent remained channeled in directions that posed no real threat to established power structures. The arms caches discovered throughout Europe during the 1980s revealed the extraordinary scope of Gladio preparations for continental warfare. In the Netherlands, walkers in a forest near Roosendaal stumbled upon a hidden depot containing dozens of hand grenades, semi-automatic rifles, automatic pistols, and enough explosives to level a city block. Similar discoveries in Belgium, Switzerland, and Germany uncovered arsenals that included everything from individual weapons to heavy military equipment capable of conducting sustained guerrilla operations against occupying forces. The Swiss Stay-Behind Network, code-named P-26, had established arms caches in mountain valleys throughout the Alps, taking advantage of the country's traditions of civilian military service and decentralized defense planning. Swiss investigators discovered that the organization had compiled detailed targeting lists identifying political leaders, journalists, and intellectuals who were to be eliminated in the event of communist electoral victory. The lists included not only Swiss citizens, but also foreign refugees who had fled to Switzerland seeking asylum from authoritarian governments in Eastern Europe and Latin America. The technological sophistication of Gladio communications networks rivaled those of regular military forces, utilizing encryption systems and radio equipment that enabled secure coordination across continental distances. The primary communication hub was located at a classified facility near Stuttgart, Germany, where former Wehrmacht signal officers provided technical expertise while American communications specialists supplied advanced equipment and training. The network maintained constant contact with CIA stations throughout Europe, ensuring that operations could be coordinated in real time despite the involvement of multiple national intelligence services and terrorist organizations. Dr. Heinrich Müller, the former Wehrmacht psychiatrist who had developed personality assessment protocols for Gladio recruitment, later testified about the psychological conditioning programs used to prepare operatives for conducting attacks against civilian targets. The process involved systematic desensitization to violence combined with ideological indoctrination that portrayed terrorism against domestic populations as a necessary defense of Western civilization. Subjects underwent months of training that included exposure to increasingly graphic violence, participation in simulated torture sessions, and indoctrination in political theories that justified extreme measures against supposed internal enemies. The conditioning programs were designed to create individuals capable of maintaining normal social relationships while simultaneously conducting operations that required extraordinary psychological compartmentalization. Successful graduates demonstrated what Müller termed functional sociopathy, the ability to commit acts of extreme violence without experiencing the emotional distress that would normally accompany such behavior. These were not psychopaths or sadists, but rather ordinary citizens who had been systematically programmed to view political terrorism as patriotic duty. The financial costs of maintaining Gladio networks throughout Europe required resources that dwarfed the budgets of many national intelligence services. Conservative estimates suggest that the CIA channeled over $2 billion through Vatican and Swiss banking networks to fund stay-behind operations between 1950 and 1990. The money paid for everything from weapons and training to the salaries of full-time operatives and the maintenance of communication networks that spanned the continent. Additional funding came from profits generated by drug trafficking operations, arms smuggling, and financial fraud conducted by criminal organizations operating under intelligence protection. The human costs of the strategy of tension became clear only gradually as investigators pieced together evidence from archives scattered across Europe and North America. Conservative estimates suggest that Gladio-related operations killed over 600 people and wounded thousands more between 1969 and 1987. These figures include only confirmed cases where documentary evidence directly linked attacks to stay-behind networks. The actual toll was almost certainly much higher when accounting for operations that remained classified or were successfully attributed to other causes. As the 1980s progressed, changes in the international situation began to undermine the strategic rationale for continued Gladio operations. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, followed by his policies of glasnost and perestroika, reduced fears of immediate communist expansion while simultaneously strengthening reform movements within European communist parties. The strategy of tension, which had been designed to prevent electoral victories by unreformed Stalinist parties, became increasingly irrelevant as those parties evolved toward democratic socialism or disappeared entirely. Yet the networks persisted, driven by institutional momentum and the personal interests of individuals who had built careers around the machinery of secret warfare. By the late 1980s, many Gladio operatives had become involved in criminal activities that had little connection to their original anti-communist mission. Arms trafficking, drug smuggling, and financial fraud provided both funding and employment for former intelligence officers whose skills had limited application in the post-Cold War world. The revelation of Operation Gladio's existence in October 1990 marked the beginning of a reckoning that European democracies had postponed for 4 decades. But for the architects of the strategy of tension, for the handlers who had orchestrated decades of violence, and for the operatives who had carried out attacks that traumatized entire populations, accountability would prove as elusive as the shadows they had inhabited for so long. The gladiators had served their masters well, leaving behind a legacy of fear that would continue to shape European politics long after their secret war had officially ended. The morning light, streaming through the tall windows of the Italian Senate chamber on October the 24th, 1990, cast long shadows across the faces of parliamentarians who were about to witness the most extraordinary confession in the history of post-war European democracy. Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, the master of political survival who had navigated every crisis since the fall of Mussolini, stood at the podium with a 10-page document that would shatter 4 decades of carefully constructed lies. As he cleared his throat and began to read from the so-called parallel SID, the Gladio case, the assembled senators understood they were witnessing not merely a political revelation, but the collapse of an entire worldview that had defined Western civilization since 1945. The document that Andreotti held in his trembling hands had been extracted from the military intelligence archives at Fortebraschi through the relentless investigation of Judge Felice Casson, whose examination of the Petiano bombing had opened a door that intelligence services across Europe had assumed would remain sealed forever. The CFA document, stamped Cosmic Top Secret and dating from 1959, revealed for the first time the true scope of Operation Gladio, not merely an Italian aberration but a continental conspiracy that had operated under direct NATO supervision for over 3 decades. The confession that poured from Andreotti's lips contained details that stunned even veteran political observers who thought they understood the Byzantine nature of Italian power structures. He admitted that Gladio maintained 139 arms caches scattered across Italy, hidden in forests, meadows, churches, and cemeteries by operatives who had received training from American and British special forces. The arsenal included portable arms, ammunition, explosives, hand grenades, 60mm mortars, recoilless rifles, sniper rifles, radio transmitters, and specialized assassination equipment provided directly by the CIA. Most damaging of all, Andreotti revealed that Italy had joined the Allied Clandestine Committee in 1964, 7 years after its creation by the United States, France, Belgium, and Greece. This committee had been responsible for directing Gladio operations across Western Europe, ensuring that stay-behind networks remained coordinated through NATO command structures while maintaining plausible deniability for democratic governments that publicly knew nothing of their existence. The Prime Minister's admission that the operation was still active, contradicting his initial claim that it had been dissolved, sent shockwaves through European capitals where similar networks had operated in absolute secrecy. The European Parliament's response to Andreotti's revelations demonstrated the magnitude of the crisis facing Western democracy. On November 22, 1990, parliamentarians passed a resolution condemning NATO and the United States for their role in Gladio terrorism and for jeopardizing the democratic structures of European nations. The resolution demanded full disclosure of all stay-behind operations and called for parliamentary investigations in every country where such networks had operated. Yet the response from national governments revealed the limited power of democratic institutions when confronted with intelligence operations that had been designed to operate beyond their oversight. Only 3 countries, Italy, Belgium, and Switzerland, conducted meaningful parliamentary investigations into their stay-behind networks. The administration of President George H.W. Bush refused to comment on American involvement in Gladio operations, invoking national security considerations that effectively placed 4 decades of psychological warfare beyond the reach of democratic accountability. Other NATO governments followed the American lead, offering carefully worded denials that acknowledged the existence of defensive preparations against Soviet invasion while denying any involvement in domestic terrorism or political manipulation. The Belgian investigation, conducted under the chairmanship of Senator Guy Coemi, uncovered evidence that contradicted decades of official statements about the country's security policies. The parliamentary committee discovered that the Belgian Stay-Behind Network, code-named SDRA-8, had maintained detailed surveillance files on over 40,000 Belgian citizens whose political views were deemed potentially subversive. The organization had compiled targeting lists identifying specific individuals who were to be eliminated in the event of communist electoral victory, including teachers, union leaders, social workers, and journalists whose only crime was advocating for social democratic policies. The committee's final report revealed that Estere 8 had received over $4 million in CIA funding between 1952 and 1985, channeled through the Belgian Military Intelligence Service, and hidden in off-budget accounts that avoided parliamentary oversight. The money had purchased not only weapons and communication equipment, but also the services of professional assassins recruited from criminal organizations throughout Europe. Most disturbing of all, the committee discovered evidence that SGRA 8 operatives had been involved in the wave of terrorist attacks that had terrorized Belgium during the 1980s, conducting false flag operations designed to discredit peace movements and maintain public support for NATO nuclear deployments. The Swiss investigation produced revelations that challenged the country's cherished mythology of neutrality and democratic governance. Parliamentary investigators discovered that the P-26 network had established arms caches throughout the Alpine valleys, taking advantage of Switzerland's tradition of civilian military service to create a stay-behind army that could operate indefinitely behind enemy lines. The organization had recruited heavily from Swiss military units, police forces, and right-wing political organizations, creating a parallel command structure that possessed detailed knowledge of the country's defensive preparations and mobilization procedures. Documents seized during raids on P-26 facilities revealed that the network had maintained surveillance programs targeting not only Swiss citizens, but also foreign refugees who had sought asylum from authoritarian governments in Eastern Europe and Latin America. The organization had compiled psychological profiles of political leaders, identified vulnerabilities that could be exploited for blackmail or assassination, and established contingency plans for assuming control of critical infrastructure in the event of political crisis. Most shocking of all, investigators discovered that P-26 had received funding and equipment from the CIA, despite Switzerland's official neutrality, revealing that American intelligence services had penetrated even those European countries that had refused to join NATO. The investigation into Gladio's financial networks exposed a web of corruption that extended from the Vatican Bank to major commercial institutions throughout Europe and North America. Italian magistrates discovered that Roberto Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano had served as a crucial intermediary for laundering CIA funds through a complex network of shell companies registered in tax havens from Luxembourg to the Cayman Islands. The bank's collapse in 1982 had been precipitated not by normal business failures, but by the exposure of money laundering operations that had facilitated the transfer of hundreds of millions of dollars to terrorist organizations operating under intelligence protection. Cardinal Paul Marcinkus, whose Vatican Bank had facilitated much of this illegal funding, successfully claimed ecclesiastical immunity to avoid prosecution for his role in Gladio operations. The American-born prelate's position as president of the Institute for the Works of Religion had provided perfect cover for intelligence operations that required the transfer of large sums across international borders without detection by banking regulators or law enforcement agencies. Documents seized during the investigation revealed that Marcinkus had maintained personal relationships with senior CIA officials and had participated in planning sessions for operations that extended far beyond Europe to include Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The human cost of Operation Gladio became clearer as investigators gained access to classified files that had been sealed for decades. Conservative estimates suggested that Gladio-related operations had killed over 600 people and wounded thousands more between 1969 and 1987. These figures included only confirmed cases where documentary evidence directly linked attacks to stay-behind networks. The actual toll was almost certainly much higher when accounting for operations that remained classified or had been successfully attributed to other causes. The victims represented a cross-section of European society. Railway workers killed in the Bologna bombing, shoppers murdered in Belgian supermarket attacks, police officers assassinated in false flag operations designed to be blamed on leftist terrorists, journalists who had investigated forbidden subjects too deeply, and political leaders who had advocated for policies unacceptable to NATO strategic planners. Each death had been carefully calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact on target populations, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that weakened democratic institutions while strengthening support for authoritarian measures. The psychological warfare dimension of Gladio operations extended far beyond simple violence into sophisticated manipulation of European popular culture and political discourse. Intelligence services had established extensive propaganda networks that influenced everything from newspaper editorial policies to television programming, ensuring that public debate remained within parameters acceptable to NATO's strategic objectives. Journalists who attempted to investigate stay-behind activities faced harassment, threats, and in some cases, mysterious accidents that served as warnings to their colleagues about the consequences of probing too deeply into forbidden subjects. The case of Italian journalist Mauro De Mauro, who had disappeared in September 1970 while investigating connections between the Sicilian mafia and American intelligence services, became a symbol of the risks faced by reporters who challenged the official narrative of Cold War Europe. His disappearance sent a clear message to other journalists about the consequences of investigating forbidden subjects, creating a climate of self-censorship that ensured critical information remained hidden from public scrutiny for decades. The revelation of Gladio's existence triggered investigations across Western Europe as governments were forced to acknowledge their own stay-behind networks. The German Federal Intelligence Service admitted to maintaining Organisation Gehlen, named after its founder, Reinhard Gehlen, former head of Wehrmacht intelligence on the Eastern Front. The French government confirmed the existence of Arc-en-Ciel, Rainbow, while the Netherlands acknowledged Inlichtingen en Operatie, INO. Each admission revealed the same pattern. Networks established ostensibly to resist Soviet invasion had evolved into domestic surveillance and manipulation operations that targeted their own citizens. The Turkish counter-guerrilla network, which had maintained intimate connections with the fascist Grey Wolves organization, demonstrated how Gladio tactics had been adapted to local conditions throughout the NATO alliance. The partnership between intelligence services and ultranationalist paramilitaries had facilitated a campaign of violence that claimed thousands of lives during the 1970s, culminating in the military coup of 1980 that brought General Kenan Evren to power with support from NATO and American intelligence services. The drug trafficking operations that had financed Gladio networks represented one of the most morally compromising aspects of the entire program. Italian magistrate Carlo Palermo's investigations during the 1980s had uncovered evidence of NATO weaponry being exchanged for heroin along the Balkan route, a smuggling corridor that stretched from Turkey through Bulgaria to Western Europe. The profits from this illegal trade had been funneled back into intelligence operations, creating a self-sustaining criminal enterprise that operated under the protection of the same institutions supposedly fighting the war on drugs. The Susurluk scandal in Turkey during the 1990s provided a glimpse into the continuing legacy of Gladio operations, revealing how the networks established during the Cold War had evolved into permanent institutions that served the interests of what Turkish observers termed the deep state. The collision of a Mercedes sedan carrying a police chief, a Kurdish clan leader turned government agent, and a beauty queen revealed connections between intelligence services, organized crime, and ultranationalist organizations that had persisted long after the Soviet threat had disappeared. The exposure of Operation Gladio's Turkish dimension revealed how stay-behind networks had been used not only against communist parties, but against any political movements that challenged established power structures. The Kurdish separatist movement, Islamic political organizations, and even moderate social democratic parties had found themselves targets of violence orchestrated by the same intelligence networks that had been created to defend democracy against foreign invasion. The technique of using extremist proxies to conduct violence that could be blamed on political opponents had proven so effective that it had been adapted for use against a wide variety of domestic and international targets. The contemporary relevance of Gladio tactics became evident through their application in conflicts far from Europe. Intelligence analysis of operations in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia revealed the same patterns of false flag attacks, media manipulation, and the use of criminal organizations as proxies for state violence. The techniques pioneered in post-war Europe had been exported worldwide, creating a global network of covert operations that operated beyond the oversight of democratic institutions in any country. The revelation in November 2024 that British intelligence services had created Project Alchemy, a Ministry of Defense cell tasked with keeping Ukraine fighting at all costs, demonstrated that Gladio-style operations continued into the 21st century. The unit's recommendations included the creation of stay-behind networks to conduct assassinations and sabotage in Russian territory, revealing that the fundamental logic of Operation Gladio, the use of terrorist tactics to achieve strategic objectives, remained embedded in Western intelligence doctrine. The failure of democratic institutions to hold intelligence services accountable for 4 decades of illegal operations revealed the fundamental weakness of constitutional government when confronted with organizations designed to operate in the shadows. Despite overwhelming evidence of criminal activity, virtually no intelligence officers faced prosecution for their roles in Gladio operations. The doctrine of national security provided blanket immunity for crimes that would have resulted in life imprisonment for ordinary citizens, creating a parallel legal system that protected state terrorists while prosecuting their victims. The amnesia that settled over European public discourse regarding Operation Gladio demonstrated the power of intelligence services to shape historical memory even after their operations had been exposed. Within a decade of Andreotti's revelations, references to stay-behind networks had largely disappeared from mainstream media coverage, consigned to the realm of conspiracy theory despite overwhelming documentary evidence of their existence. History textbooks minimized or ignored entirely the role of NATO and American intelligence services in sponsoring terrorism against European populations, ensuring that future generations would remain ignorant of one of the most significant political scandals of the 20th century. The families of Gladio victims found themselves confronting not only the trauma of their losses, but the systematic denial of justice that characterized the official response to the revelations. Courts dismissed lawsuits against intelligence services, citing national security considerations that effectively placed state terrorism beyond the reach of civil justice. Survivors of terrorist attacks discovered that the same governments that had promised to protect them from violence had been orchestrating that violence from the beginning, creating a psychological burden that extended far beyond physical injuries. The psychiatric evaluation of former Gladio operatives revealed disturbing patterns of psychological conditioning that had enabled ordinary citizens to participate in terrorist operations against their own populations. Many subjects demonstrated what military psychologists termed moral injury, the lasting trauma that results from perpetrating acts that violate fundamental ethical principles. Yet, the compartmentalized nature of stay-behind operations had prevented most participants from understanding the full scope of the networks they served, creating a generation of intelligence assets who had been systematically deceived about the nature of their own activities. The theological implications of Vatican involvement in Gladio operations created a crisis of faith that extended throughout Catholic communities worldwide. The revelation that church hierarchy had facilitated the financing of terrorist operations challenged fundamental assumptions about the moral authority of religious institutions and their role in defending human dignity. Cardinal Marcinkus's successful claim of ecclesiastical immunity demonstrated that religious institutions could provide effective cover for criminal activity while avoiding the legal consequences that would face secular organizations engaged in similar behavior. As the 20th century drew to a close, the architects of Operation Gladio could claim a form of victory that transcended their original objectives. The stay-behind networks had never been called upon to resist Soviet invasion, but they had successfully prevented the evolution of European democracy in directions unacceptable to NATO strategic planners. Communist parties had been marginalized not through electoral defeat but through systematic violence that associated leftist politics with terrorism in the public mind. The historic compromise between Christian Democrats and Communists that had terrified American policymakers had died with Aldo Moro, ensuring that European politics remained locked in the rigid ideological divisions that served Atlantic Alliance interests. The shadow of Operation Gladio continued to fall across European politics long after the networks had been officially disbanded. The techniques of psychological warfare, false flag operations, and media manipulation that had been perfected during the Cold War remained embedded in the operational doctrine of intelligence services throughout the Western world. The gladiators had completed their mission, leaving behind a legacy of fear and suspicion that would continue to shape democratic discourse for generations to come. In the end, the revelation of Operation Gladio exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Cold War democracy. The same institutions that claimed to defend freedom had systematically undermined the democratic processes they purported to protect. The stay-behind networks had preserved Western civilization not from foreign conquest, but from the dangerous possibility that European voters might choose a different path than the one predetermined by their supposed guardians. The gladius had cut both ways, protecting democracy from its enemies while simultaneously destroying democracy from within. The digital age dawned over Europe with promises of transparency and democratic renewal, yet the ghosts of Operation Gladio found new homes in the servers and satellites of the information revolution. On September 11th, 2001, as smoke billowed from the World Trade Center towers, intelligence analysts in windowless rooms across Washington began dusting off operational manuals that had been written during the darkest days of the Cold War. The techniques perfected in the railway stations and piazzas of post-war Europe would find new application in the global war on terror, adapted for an age when surveillance could penetrate every aspect of human existence and psychological warfare could be conducted through social media algorithms that shaped the thoughts of billions. The Syrian conflict that erupted in March 2011 provided the perfect laboratory for testing updated versions of Gladio-style operations in the digital age. The White Helmets organization, officially known as the Syrian Civil Defense, emerged from the chaos of civil war with funding streams that traced back to the same intelligence networks that had once sponsored stay-behind operations in Europe. Documents leaked by former CIA contractor Edward Snowden revealed that the organization had received over $100 million in funding from the United States Agency for International Development, the British Foreign Office, and other Western government agencies that had historical connections to psychological warfare operations. The modus operandi bore striking similarities to the strategy of tension that had terrorized Europe during the 1970s and 80s. Chemical weapons attacks against civilian populations were immediately blamed on Syrian government forces, providing justification for military intervention while independent investigators struggled to access crime scenes controlled by opposition groups. The timing of these incidents consistently coincided with diplomatic initiatives that threatened to end the conflict through negotiation rather than regime change, suggesting a level of coordination that transcended spontaneous terrorist activity. James Le Mesurier, the former British military intelligence officer who founded the White Helmets, embodied the continuity between Cold War psychological operations and contemporary hybrid warfare. His background included service in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Iraq, conflicts where Western intelligence services had refined techniques of media manipulation and proxy warfare that built directly upon lessons learned during the Gladio years. The organization he created operated according to principles that would have been familiar to the architects of Operation Gladio. Use humanitarian rhetoric to disguise military operations, coordinate with media outlets to ensure proper narrative control, and maintain plausible deniability for sponsor governments through complex funding mechanisms. The mysterious death of James Le Mesurier in November 2019, falling from the balcony of his Istanbul apartment, occurred just days before he was scheduled to testify about White Helmet's funding sources to a closed session of the Turkish parliament. The circumstances bore disturbing similarities to the death of Roberto Calvi beneath Blackfriars Bridge 4 decades earlier, suggesting that the elimination of inconvenient witnesses remained standard operating procedure for intelligence networks operating in the shadows of democratic oversight. The financial infrastructure supporting contemporary Gladio-style operations had evolved to exploit the complexities of global finance and the charitable sector. The Integrity Initiative, a British government program exposed in 2018, demonstrated how intelligence services had adapted Cold War propaganda techniques for the Internet age. The organization operated through a network of clusters in European countries, each comprising journalists, academics, and political figures who promoted narratives favorable to NATO's strategic objectives while maintaining the appearance of independent commentary. Documents leaked by hacktivist group Anonymous revealed that the Integrity Initiative had received over £2 million in funding from the British Foreign Office to conduct what officials euphemistically termed countering disinformation. The program's internal communications revealed a more sinister reality. Systematic efforts to manipulate public opinion, discredit political figures who advocated for improved relations with Russia, and coordinate messaging across European media outlets to ensure narrative consistency. The techniques were identical to those employed by Gladio propaganda networks, updated for an era when information warfare could be conducted through social media platforms rather than traditional news outlets. The role of private military companies in contemporary Gladio-style operations provided new mechanisms for maintaining plausible deniability while conducting violence that would be illegal if carried out directly by government forces. The Wagner Group, Blackwater, and similar organizations operated as modern equivalents of the criminal proxies that intelligence services had used during the Cold War, providing specialized violence while allowing sponsor governments to deny direct involvement in their activities. The evolution of stay-behind networks into permanent institutions became most visible through the activities of the Atlantic Council, a Washington-based think tank that served as a coordination center for contemporary psychological warfare operations. The organization's Digital Forensic Research Lab, established in 2016, pioneered techniques for manipulating online discourse through coordinated inauthentic behavior, content moderation policies that suppressed dissenting voices, and algorithmic amplification of preferred narratives. The lab's staff included former intelligence officers from agencies that had been involved in Operation Gladio, suggesting direct institutional continuity between Cold War psychological operations and contemporary information warfare. The Ukrainian conflict that began in February 2022 provided the most comprehensive demonstration of how Gladio tactics had been adapted for 21st century warfare. The revelation in November 2024 that British intelligence had created Project Alchemy, a Ministry of Defense cell tasked with keeping Ukraine fighting at all costs, exposed contemporary application of stay-behind principles on a massive scale. The unit's recommendations included the creation of networks to conduct assassinations and sabotage in Russian territory, revealing that the fundamental logic of Operation Gladio remained embedded in Western intelligence doctrine. The use of encrypted communication platforms like Signal and Telegram to coordinate proxy forces in Ukraine demonstrated how digital technology had revolutionized the logistics of clandestine warfare while maintaining the same basic operational principles that had guided Gladio networks during the analog era. Intelligence services could now recruit, train, and direct terrorist operations across continental distances without the elaborate radio networks and dead-drop protocols that had characterized Cold War operations. The democratization of violence through readily available technology had made Gladio-style operations accessible to a wider range of state and party-state actors, while making attribution increasingly difficult for investigators. The role of non-governmental organizations in contemporary Gladio-style operations provided perfect cover for activities that would face scrutiny if conducted directly by intelligence services. Organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, Freedom House, and the International Republican Institute operated programs in dozens of countries worldwide, promoting what they termed democratic development, while pursuing regime change objectives that served the strategic interests of their government sponsors. The techniques were identical to those employed by Gladio networks during the Cold War: identify and cultivate political figures willing to serve foreign interests, provide funding and training for opposition movements, and coordinate media campaigns designed to destabilize governments that pursued policies unacceptable to Western strategic planners. The Belarus protests of 2020 demonstrated how color revolution techniques had evolved from the street-level violence that characterized Gladio operations during the Cold War into sophisticated psychological warfare campaigns conducted primarily through social media manipulation. The opposition movement that emerged following the August 9th presidential election relied heavily on encrypted communication platforms, cryptocurrency funding mechanisms, and coordinated messaging campaigns that bore the hallmarks of professional intelligence operations rather than spontaneous democratic uprising. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the opposition figure who claimed victory in the disputed election, fled to Lithuania within days of the vote count, where she established a government in exile that received immediate recognition from European Union institutions and substantial financial support from Western government agencies. Her transformation from unknown political spouse to international diplomatic figure occurred with a speed and efficiency that suggested careful preparation by experienced handlers familiar with the techniques of regime change operations. The role of cryptocurrency in financing contemporary Gladio-style operations represented a significant evolution from the traditional banking networks that had facilitated Cold War psychological warfare. Digital currencies provided mechanisms for transferring funds across international borders without detection by financial regulators or law enforcement agencies, while blockchain technology created permanent records that could be used to trace funding sources if operations were exposed. Intelligence services had quickly adapted to exploit these new possibilities, using cryptocurrency exchanges and mixing services to launder funds for proxy operations while maintaining plausible deniability through complex transaction chains. The emergence of artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies had revolutionized the psychological warfare dimension of contemporary Gladio-style operations. Advanced algorithms could analyze social media behavior to identify individuals susceptible to recruitment or manipulation, while deepfake technology enabled the creation of false evidence that could be used to discredit political opponents or justify military intervention. The scale and sophistication of these capabilities far exceeded anything available to Cold War intelligence services. Yet, the fundamental objectives remained identical: shape public opinion to serve strategic objectives while maintaining the appearance of organic political development. The January 6, 2021 assault on the United States Capitol demonstrated how Gladio-style psychological warfare could be directed against domestic populations within NATO member countries themselves. The event bore striking similarities to strategy of tension operations that had terrorized Europe during the Cold War. Carefully orchestrated violence designed to create political crisis, media coverage that emphasized threats to democratic institutions, and subsequent legislation that expanded surveillance powers while restricting civil liberties. The only significant difference was the target population, American citizens rather than European ones. The role of social media platforms in facilitating contemporary psychological warfare represented a quantum leap in the capabilities available to intelligence services conducting Gladio-style operations. Companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Google possess detailed psychological profiles of billions of users, enabling micro-targeted propaganda campaigns that could influence political behavior with unprecedented precision. The platform's content moderation policies provided mechanisms for suppressing dissenting voices while amplifying preferred narratives, creating echo chambers that reinforced official messaging while marginalizing alternative perspectives. The integration of private sector technology companies into intelligence operations had created new forms of public-private partnership that exceeded even the close cooperation between Vatican Bank and CIA financial networks during the Cold War. The revolving door between Silicon Valley and intelligence agencies ensured that digital platforms were designed to facilitate surveillance and manipulation from their inception, while terms of service agreements provided legal cover for activities that would violate constitutional protections if conducted directly by government agencies. The Global Disinformation Index, established in 2018 with funding from the British Foreign Office and other Western government agencies, demonstrated how intelligence services had adapted Gladio propaganda techniques for the digital age. The organization maintained blacklists of news outlets and independent journalists whose coverage challenged official narratives, working with advertising technology companies to defund alternative media while directing revenue toward establishment publications that promoted preferred messaging. The techniques were identical to those employed by Gladio networks during the Cold War, updated for an era when economic warfare could be conducted through algorithmic manipulation rather than direct violence. The medical dimension of contemporary Gladio-style operations became apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic, when governments throughout the Western world implemented lockdown policies that suspended democratic rights and freedoms on a scale that exceeded even the emergency measures justified by strategy of tension terrorism during the Cold War. The coordination of messaging across multiple countries, the suppression of scientific dissent through social media censorship, and the use of fear-based propaganda to justify authoritarian measures demonstrated that psychological warfare techniques pioneered by Gladio networks had been successfully adapted for public health emergencies. The role of pharmaceutical companies in contemporary Gladio-style operations paralleled the involvement of organized crime in Cold War psychological warfare, providing specialized services that governments could not legally perform themselves while maintaining plausible deniability through regulatory capture and financial incentive structures. The mRNA vaccine technologies that were deployed during the pandemic had been developed with substantial funding from defense agencies, suggesting that medical interventions could serve dual-use purposes that extended beyond public health into areas of social control and population manipulation. The emergence of environmental activism as a vehicle for contemporary Gladio-style operations demonstrated how intelligence services had adapted to changing political circumstances while maintaining the same fundamental objectives that had guided Cold War psychological warfare. Organizations like Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future promoted policies that would transfer substantial economic power to international institutions while reducing the sovereignty of individual nation-states. Outcomes that served the same globalization agenda that had motivated Gladio operations against nationalist political movements during previous decades. The role of climate science in contemporary psychological warfare bore striking similarities to the use of anti-communist ideology during the Cold War, providing a totalizing worldview that justified extreme measures while delegitimizing opposition as morally unacceptable. The systematic suppression of scientific dissent through academic censorship, media blacklisting, and professional ostracism demonstrated that intelligence services had successfully adapted the techniques of ideological control that had been pioneered during the Gladio era for application to environmental issues that served contemporary strategic objectives. The financial mechanisms supporting contemporary Gladio-style operations had evolved to exploit the charitable sector and environmental movement in ways that provided even better cover than the Vatican bank connections that had facilitated Cold War psychological warfare. Organizations like the Open Society Foundations, established by financier George Soros, channeled billions of dollars to activist groups worldwide while maintaining the appearance of philanthropic activity rather than intelligence operations. The funding streams created networks of influence that extended throughout civil society, academia, and government, providing mechanisms for coordinating policy across multiple countries while maintaining plausible deniability for sponsor organizations. The migration crisis that began affecting Europe in 2015 demonstrated how contemporary Gladio-style operations could exploit humanitarian concerns to achieve strategic objectives that would be difficult to justify through conventional political processes. The coordinated media campaigns that promoted mass migration, the systematic suppression of crime statistics that revealed negative consequences, and the intimidation of political figures who advocated for border controls bore the hallmarks of psychological warfare operations rather than spontaneous humanitarian response. The role of international law in contemporary Gladio-style operations provided new mechanisms for constraining national sovereignty while advancing the same globalization agenda that had motivated Cold War psychological warfare against nationalist political movements. The International Criminal Court, the European Court of Human Rights, and similar institutions served as vehicles for prosecuting political figures who pursued policies unacceptable to international elites while providing legal cover for intelligence operations conducted under humanitarian pretexts. The emergence of cancel culture as a tool of contemporary gladio-style operations demonstrated how psychological warfare techniques had been successfully adapted for deployment against domestic populations within Western countries themselves. The systematic destruction of careers, reputations, and social relationships for expressing politically incorrect opinions created an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship that was more effective than the direct violence that had characterized strategy of tension operations during the Cold War. The role of academic institutions in contemporary gladio-style operations exceeded even their involvement in Cold War psychological warfare, providing both intellectual justification for intelligence operations and training grounds for future operatives. Universities throughout the Western world had been transformed into ideological institutions that promoted globalist perspectives while systematically suppressing nationalist, traditionalist, or anti-establishment viewpoints. The techniques of academic censorship, speech codes, and ideological conformity created environments that were more restrictive than anything achieved through direct government control during previous authoritarian periods. The generational dimension of contemporary gladio-style operations represented perhaps their most significant evolution from Cold War psychological warfare. Rather than targeting specific political movements or demographic groups, contemporary operations focused on reshaping the consciousness of entire generations through educational curricula, entertainment media, and social media manipulation that began in childhood and continued throughout adolescence and young adulthood. The techniques created populations that were systematically conditioned to support globalization policies while viewing nationalism, traditionalism, and skepticism toward authority as morally unacceptable. The theological implications of contemporary gladio-style operations extended beyond the corruption of specific religious institutions to encompass the systematic replacement of traditional spiritual beliefs with secular ideologies that served the same social control functions while providing even less resistance to manipulation by psychological warfare specialists. Climate change activism, social justice movements, and public health campaigns had been successfully transformed into quasi-religious belief systems that provided meaning and purpose for populations that had been systematically disconnected from traditional sources of spiritual authority. The legacy of Operation Gladio had evolved into something far more ambitious and comprehensive than its Cold War architects had ever imagined possible. The stay-behind networks that had been designed to resist foreign invasion had metastasized into permanent institutions capable of reshaping human consciousness on a global scale. The techniques of psychological warfare that had been employed against specific political movements during the Cold War had been scaled up for application against entire civilizations, creating mechanisms of social control that exceeded the ambitions of even the most totalitarian regimes in human history. Yet the very success of these operations had created vulnerabilities that their architects had not anticipated. The digital technologies that enabled unprecedented surveillance and manipulation also provided ordinary citizens with access to information and communication capabilities that had previously been restricted to intelligence agencies and major media organizations. The same social media platforms that facilitated psychological warfare also enabled alternative narratives to emerge and spread beyond the control of traditional gatekeepers. The revelation of Operation Gladio's existence in 1990 had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated psychological warfare campaigns could eventually be exposed through persistent investigation and archive research. The digital age had accelerated both the pace of operations and the speed of exposure, creating unstable conditions where decades of carefully constructed narratives could be demolished within days through viral social media campaigns or strategic document releases. The families of Gladio victims who had waited decades for justice found themselves joined by new generations of casualties from contemporary psychological warfare operations. The techniques had evolved, but the human cost remained constant. Individuals whose lives had been destroyed by intelligence operations they could not comprehend, communities that had been systematically manipulated into supporting policies against their own interests, and entire nations whose sovereignty had been subverted by allies claiming to defend their freedom. The children and grandchildren of those who had survived the strategy of tension now found themselves confronting updated versions of the same psychological warfare techniques that had terrorized their parents and grandparents. The gladiators had passed their swords to new generations of handlers and assets, but the fundamental logic of their operations remained unchanged. Democracy must be protected from the dangerous possibility that populations might choose paths different from those predetermined by their guardians. In the end, the revelation of Operation Gladio had provided not closure, but a glimpse into the true nature of power in the contemporary world. The shadow networks that had operated behind the facade of Cold War democracy had not been disbanded, but had evolved into permanent institutions capable of global social engineering. The gladius continued to cut both ways, protecting freedom from its enemies while simultaneously destroying freedom from within. The rain that had fallen on Petiano on that morning in May 1972 had never really stopped. It had simply learned to fall invisibly, through fiber optic cables and satellite transmissions, through social media algorithms and cryptocurrency transactions, through medical mandates and environmental regulations. The echo chamber of ghosts continued to whisper their deadly songs, shaping the thoughts and dreams of billions who remained unaware that their minds had become the final battlefield in a war that had never ended.